In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you why spears are the best weapon in Elden Ring. This is our 15th video showcasing all the weapons within a particular weapon group and showing you their strengths and weaknesses to help you better decide which one should be a part of your build. Before we get into that, however, first let's talk about the pros and cons of this weapon group along with the styles of play that I think most players will use when using these weapon types. So let's take a look at the pros of this weapon group. First, I think is the most obvious, which is the length of these weapons. Spears are some of the longest weapons in Elden Ring, allowing you to hit targets from a good distance away while you're staying safe. Another big pro of this weapon is that they're able to do counter damage rather easily. Counter damage in Elden Ring is where you deal thrust damage to an enemy that is mid their attack animation. This is not the wind up of their attack animation, this is actually the forward attack animation. So this is a very small window, but you need to deal thrust damage during that animation in order to gain increased damage to enemies. And since spears have predominantly thrust damage, they are the de facto weapon type that's good at this because of their range as well. And this is why the Spear Talisman is actually named after them. And this talisman increases the amount of counter damage that you deal when you deal thrust damage to an enemy that is amid that animation. Another really big perk of this weapon group is that you can actually hold block and attack with your shield up, not unlike the heavy thrusting swords or thrusting swords. So you can actually protect yourself and attack at the same time. And last but not least, I would say that their dual-wield attack animation is extremely fast, and in some cases it even feels like it's faster than regular R1 attacks. Moving along to the cons, the first is that they deal almost exclusively thrust damage. This is kind of a double-edged sword. While it allows you to get that counter damage more easily, it also makes you in a situation where if enemies are resistant to thrust, you don't have a lot of options to get around that. So having almost exclusively thrust damage can be bad for this weapon type as well. And another point piggybacking off this as well is because spears tend to thrust forward in a straight line, they don't sweep or slash through their attacks. They have smaller hitboxes than a lot of weapons that can catch enemies that move at the last second, whereas this weapon type has trouble with that. And also a lot of enemies have like concave body shapes where if you lock onto their torso, you're attacking at the furthest possible distance instead of something closer like the leg or the arm, allowing you to miss a lot of times while you're attacking. Moving along to the styles of play that I think most people will use when using spears, I think there's basically two styles of play available to most players. There are exceptions to this, but I think generally you're either going to use a shield and a spear, using some sort of block counter setup or some sort of hoplite build where you turtle behind your shield and poke enemies, or you're going to dual wield spears and really lean into that fast attack of two spears at the same time. Spears generally don't have the highest damage of most weapons in this game, so getting that dual wield setup will allow you to kill enemies a lot more quickly. That's not to say that you cannot make a hybrid build with these weapon types, it's just that I feel like most people will lean into those two styles of play. Now that we've got those things out of the way, let's get into the unique spears first. First up is the Torchpole. The Torchpole shares the default attack of most spears and deals physical and fire damage, and has an average weight for a spear in Elden Ring weighing 6, and requires some points in strength and some in dexterity in order to use. The Torchpole has abysmal damage, but it does have a couple things going for it. It can be acquired early on in Stormveil Castle by farming enemies there that wield it, and it's the third longest spear, and it generates light and dark places that allows you to see more easily. Its weapon skill Charge Forth is not unique and performs okay as far as weapon skills go, as you can often get it off without problems. However, it does have a long windup and doesn't perform that well against bosses. The sweet spot for this weapon is right about 50 strength and 50 dexterity with a sharp drop off from this point forward. When combined with the fact that the fire damage on this weapon does not scale whatsoever, you will likely not be able to use this weapon beyond your first playthrough easily, as you won't get hardly any more damage out of it. Because this weapon has such poor damage, I highly recommend dual wielding it with another spear of about the same length like the Pike or Cross-Naginata. Make sure to equip the Spear Talisman when set up this way, and also things like Millicent's Prosthesis or Rotten Wing Sword Insignia to further boost your damage. Or if you don't want to play that way, using a Great Shield with it and block countering. Because the Torchpole is so long, and because you can boost block counter damage with Curved Sword Talisman and follow up criticals with Dagger Talisman, block countering with this weapon deals much higher damage than regular attacks. Additionally, adding some faith in order to use Flame Grant Me Strength and Golden Vow can go a long way towards boosting damage, so I highly recommend doing so if you really want to use this weapon. Next up is the Inquisitor's Girandole. The Inquisitor's Girandole shares the default attack of most spears and deals physical and fire damage. It has a heavy weight for a spear in Elden Ring weighing 7.5, and requires some points in strength, dexterity, and faith in order to use. The Inquisitor's Girandole is a pretty solid spear. It's one of 3 spears that has natively build up on hit. You can get it somewhat early on in the game if you get grabbed at the bottom of Raya Lucaria Academy, and it deals pretty good damage for a spear. The downside is that it's rather short for a spear, and even though you can acquire it somewhat early on, you might have difficulty doing so since the boss you must defeat is not an easy fight for a low-level character. Its weapon skill, Charge Forth, is okay and is definitely situational, but you may have trouble using it against bosses that have high poise. The sweet spot for this weapon is 50 Faith, 50 Strength, and 50 Dexterity, though you likely won't get there in one playthrough, making this an ideal weapon for New Game Plus. And even though this weapon does have B scaling in Faith, it only moderately outperforms Strength and Dexterity, so where you put your points with this weapon is really up to how you want to play it. The Inquisitor's Girandole does scale well up to 80 Faith though, so make sure you do this after all of these are up to 50. There are really two ways you can play this weapon effectively, and that's either block countering with some incantations, not unlike my Lightning Lancer build, or by dual wielding it with something like the Spiked Spear to get increased damage on attack, and to give yourself the best possible chance to trigger hemorrhage on enemies and bosses. If you're block countering, use a Great Shield for the best possible guard boost and hardness, and split your stats between Faith and Strength with minimum Dexterity. Use the Clawmark Seal for buffs and any offensive incantations you like, ideally fire-based. Use the Curved Sword Talisman, Spear Talisman, Fire Scorpion Charm, and something like the Ritual Sword Talisman to maximize your overall damage. If you're going to dual wield, you can put the Inquisitor's Girandole in your left hand if you want to use a different Ash of War on Spiked Spear since it's infusible, but Charge Forth is not terrible. Split your stats evenly between Strength and Dexterity with 25 points in Faith for Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength, so that you can use these against more challenging enemies. Use Millicent's Prosthesis and Winged Sword Insignia as well as Spear Talisman for increased damage since these weapons attack quickly with L1. Consider adding White Mask and Lord of Blood's Exaltation for boss fights for increased attack power during these situations as well. Next up we have the Crystal Spear. The Crystal Spear shares the default attack of most spears and deals physical and magic damage. It has an average weight for a spear in Elden Ring weighing 5.5, and requires some points in Strength, Dexterity, and Intelligence in order to wield. Of all the weapons I've covered in my Elden Ring videos, this might be the first weapon that I cannot find anything good or anything bad about. The Crystal Spear has average length, average damage. It can be found somewhat early, but not really early in the game. In short, the Crystal Spear is a solid spear that won't let you down, nor will it blow your mind. Impaling Thrust, though, is a solid weapon skill and arguably underrated by most players out there. The damage of it is not insane, but it has great reach with the spear weapon type, and it has excellent stance damage, making it incredibly easy to stagger enemies and get critical strikes. And since this weapon skill only costs 9 FP, if you have the Assassin's Cerulean Dagger equipped, you can use it nearly infinitely. Think of it as a more cost-efficient Transient Moonlight, but with less overall stance damage. The sweet spot for this weapon is at minimum Strength and Intelligence and 50 Dexterity, but it scales well up to 80 Dexterity, which should be your first goal. Once there, you can pump Strength, which has decent scaling up to 50 despite its D rating, but from that point onward, you won't get much out of this weapon. Intelligence does not scale well at all, so this weapon does not make a good candidate for a Spell Spear. Either pair this spear with another dex scaling spear for a dual wield style of play, or use something like the Carry a Knight Shield and Shield and Spirit. Of the two styles, I prefer Shield and Spear simply because Impaling Thrust is exceptional, and you won't need the extra weapon if you're using it often, which you should if you're using the Crystal Spear. Charged R2 and Impaling Thrust R2 is a nasty combo against tougher enemies. If you do decide to Shield and Spear, use Scholar's Shield and Great Shield Talisman to further improve your guard boost of Carry a Knight Shield, and make sure to slot Warrior Jar Shard or Shard of Alexander and Assassin's Cerulean Dagger for better Impaling Thrust performance. Next up is the Rotten Crystal Spear. The Rotten Crystal Spear shares the default attack of most spears and deals physical and magic damage. It has an average weight for a spear in Elden Ring weighing 5.5 and requires some points in Strength, Dexterity, and Intelligence in order to wield. The four major differences between the Rotten Crystal Spear and Crystal Spear are 1. That it does Scarlet Rot buildup on hit, 2. It does about 5% less damage per hit, 3. It has a different weapon skill and Charge Forth, and 4. You won't find it until damn near the very end of the game in the Hallowed Tree area, making them more of an NG plus weapon. The stat requirements, weight, and length of these weapons are the same, as is the manner in which they scale, so you should definitely focus on Dexterity if you're using this weapon, keeping minimum requirements in Strength and Intelligence. However, I'd play these weapons differently. While I'm partial to Sword and Spear with the standard Crystal version of this weapon, I like dual wielding this weapon ideally with 2 Rotten Crystal Spears if possible. This is because Charge Forth frankly is not as good as Impaling Thrust, so you simply won't use it as much, and because it's much easier to set Scarlet Rot when you can hit with 2 sources of it at the same time. Much like other dual-wield spear setups, Winged Sword Insignia and Millicent's Prosthesis are good for boosting attack power, and in this case, Mushroom Helm and Kindred of Rot's Exaltation are good for boss fights. Next we have the Cleanrot Spear. The Cleanrot Spear shares an R2 attack with a short spear that thrusts twice rapidly and deals physical and holy damage. It has an average weight for a spear in Elden Ring weighing 5.5 and requires some points in Strength, Dexterity, and Faith in order to wield. The Cleanrot Spear has decent damage and has an excellent R2 attack that helps trigger talismans like Winged Sword Insignia and Millicent's Prosthesis, It boosts the immunity stat, which helps you better resist poison and scarlet rot, and it can be acquired fairly early on from farming Cleanrot Knights in Caelid. However, it does some holy damage, and many bosses resist this damage type, particularly endgame bosses. Its weapon skill, Sacred Phalanx, does decent damage, but it has a rather long windup, making it tricky to use without getting hit. Additionally, the actual spears that come out of the ground deal 100% holy damage, which makes things interesting. This allows you to boost the damage of these spears easily with Sacred Scorpion Charm and Holy Shroud and Cracked Tear, as well as Warrior Jar Shard or Shard of Alexander, but again, holy damage is resisted by many difficult bosses, making this problematic in key areas of the game. The sweet spot for this weapon is at 50 strength and 50 dexterity with minimum points into Faith. Faith scales poorly with this weapon, so I recommend only taking it up to 25 to pick up Golden Vow and some other buffs. The weapon doesn't scale well otherwise, which makes it less viable with each playthrough past NG+. Since the R2 attack of this weapon hits twice, which is good for triggering Winged Sword Insignia, etc., and you have decent strength, I recommend one-handing this weapon with a Great Shield for block counters, allowing you to use R2 when you can and also use Sacred Phalanx when needed. Make sure you slot Assassin's Cerulean Dagger to help offset some of your FP cost for Golden Vow and other buffs, as well as your weapon skill. Next is the Death Ritual Spear. The Death Ritual Spear has a slashing R2 shared with the Partisan and Spiked Spear, and deals physical and magic damage. It has an average weight for a spear in Elden Ring weighing 6.5, and requires some points in strength, dexterity, and intelligence in order to wield. The Death Ritual Spear is easily one of the best spears in Elden Ring. It has high attack rating, it has the highest critical rating of all spears, making it great for block counters, and it has a slashing R2 that allows you to deal a different damage type rather than thrusting should the need arise. This R2 is also great for hitting enemies that are more mobile or harder to hit with thrust attacks. The downside is that you cannot find this until near the end of the game in Mountaintops of the Giants. Spear Call Ritual is one of the best weapon skills in the game, dealing 100% magic damage and a large AoE that hits enemies over and over, and often hits larger targets even more times due to the nature of the AoE. You can absolutely melt bosses and tough-to-kill enemies if you can get the drop on them, often before they can even get an attack off. The sweet spot for this weapon is at 50 dexterity with minimum points in strength and intelligence, however it scales up to 80 dexterity quite well, and 50 strength and 50 int are not bad. This makes this an excellent weapon for NG+ and beyond. However, Spear Call Ritual gains a lot of damage from intelligence, and I mean a lot, so you must choose between more melee damage with Dex and more Spear Call Ritual damage with intelligence early on. You can really play this spear two ways. You can either lean into the intelligence and make some sort of spell spear build like I did in my Silent Spear Color, or you can go the Dex route and sword and board it utilizing block counters and taking advantage of the 110 critical rating of this weapon. Either way, make sure you use Warrior Jar Shard or Shard of Alexander and Magic Scorpion Charm to further boost your Spear Call Ritual damage. And this brings us to our last unique spear, the Bolt of Gransax. The Bolt of Gransax shares the default attack of most spears and deals physical and lightning damage. It's the heaviest spear in Elden Ring, weighing 8.5, and requires some points in strength and a lot of dexterity in order to use. The Bolt of Gransax is considered one of the legendary armaments for a reason. It not only has the highest attack rating of all unique spears, it's the second longest spear and deals increased damage to dragons and ancient dragons, which is much needed since these enemy types usually resist lightning. However, it is the heaviest spear and you cannot find it until the Lendel Royal Capital area, and you can miss it if you progress the game too far before picking it up. Ancient Lightning Spear is one of the most deadly weapon skills in Elden Ring, firing a lightning spear over extremely long distance that deals 100% lightning damage. This makes it easy to boost with Lightning Scorpion Charm and Lightning Shrouded Cracked Tear, besides the usual Warrior Jar Shard or Shard of Alexander. And because it's chargeable, which increases its damage, you can also add Godfrey Icon to further boost the damage when you charge it, allowing for some insane numbers. The sweet spot for this weapon is about 50 dexterity with minimum points in strength, but the weapon scales very well up to 80 dexterity and 50 strength. Keep in mind that only dexterity increases the lightning damage of this weapon, as well as the lightning damage of Ancient Lightning Spear. However, it's not by a terribly large amount, so make sure that you have enough strength to use a Great Shield if you want. Because Ancient Lightning Spear is so deadly and you need 20 strength anyway for the requirements for this weapon, I highly advise using some sort of block counter build that tosses Ancient Lightning Spears as necessary to pick off ranged enemies or tough to kill enemies at range. If you use the Assassin's Cerulean Dagger, you can refund 15 FP every time you critical after a block counter, helping to refund the cost of your Ancient Lightning Spears and making your life easier. Next we come to the Infusible Spears. First up, the Short Spear. The Short Spear shares an R2 attack with the Cleanrot Spear that thrusts twice rapidly and deals physical damage. It is the lightest spear in Elden Ring, weighing 4, and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to use. While the Short Spear does have extremely low attack rating and it's the second shortest spear, it's also the lightest, can be acquired from the Twin Maiden Husks and Round Table Hold, and it has an R2 that attacks twice, making it good for status effect builds, particularly since the nerfing of dual wield status effect build-up. The magic infusion leads the pack in damage here, with Sacred and Flame Art and Fire and Lightning not too far behind. It has slightly more damage with Keen than Heavy, making the choice between the two rather moot. I personally like to play this weapon with the Blood Infusion and Seppuku, mimicking a similar build as my Crimson Duelist, leaning into the R2 attacks that hit twice, and using block counters that deal much more damage than regular attacks. Use White Mask, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Millicent's Prothesis, and Winged Sword Insignia for best results. Next is the Iron Spear. The Iron Spear shares the default attack of most spears and deals physical damage. It has a light weight for a spear in Elden Ring, weighing 4.5, and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to use. The Iron Spear is tied with the Short Spear for shortest in Elden Ring. It has a very low attack rating, and you cannot find it until Necron Eternal City, meaning you would likely have a better spear than it by the time you got one anyway. Magic and Sacred and Flame Art are tied for max attack rating, with Fire and Lightning coming in second and Heavy a distant third. Heavy barely outperforms Keen, so it's not super important which you choose. If you insist on playing this weapon, either dual wield it with another spear to further boost attack damage using talismans like Winged Sword Insignia and Millicent's Prothesis, or use it with a Great Shield and use block counter styles of play in order to be a bit defensive. Impaling Thrust is a great Ash of War to choose for this, and if you use Assassin's Sterling Dagger, you can refund its cost and then some with each use. Next is the Spear. The Spear shares the default attack of most spears and deals physical damage. It has a light weight for a spear in Elden Ring, weighing 4.5, and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to use. The best thing about the spear is that it can be acquired rather early in Stormveil Castle from farming enemies, but otherwise it's the second shortest spear, and it barely outperforms the Iron Spear and Short Spear for attack rating. When it comes to damage, Fire and Lightning take the top spot, with Sacred and Flame Art and Magic essentially tied for second. Keen outperforms Heavy by about 20 attack rating, so consider going the Keen route if you don't like any of the other infusions. I like to pair this weapon with another spear and dual wield for increased damage per hit due to L1 attacks. Again, use talismans like Winged Sword Insignia and Millicent's Prothesis, as well as Spear Talisman and High Poise, so you can trade damage and you don't have to stop thrusting. Up next is the Partisan. The Partisan has a slashing R2 shared with the Spike Spear and Death Ritual Spear, and deals physical damage. It has an average weight for a spear in Elden Ring, weighing 6.5, and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to use. The Partisan is one of the better performing infusible spears with the highest base damage of all infusible spears, and it can be acquired pretty quickly from the Knight and Fort Gale located in Weaving Peninsula. It is, however, outperformed by the Spike Spear in nearly every way, so if you like this weapon, consider using the Spike Spear instead. Sacred and Flame Art are virtually tied with Magic for the top infusion, with Fire and Lightning pulling up a close second and Heavy being a distant third. The weapon has higher attack rating with Heavy than Keen by about 17 points at this level, which makes it a slightly better strength weapon than Dexterity. I recommend using this weapon with a Great Shield and block countering due to the better strength scaling, but you could dual wield it as well if you want, since the strength damage is not that much more than Dex. Up next is the Pike. The Pike has a unique upwards thrusting R2 and deals physical damage. It has a heavy weight for a spear in Elden Ring, weighing 7.5, and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to use. The Pike's claim to fame is that it's longer than all other spears, and I don't mean by a little bit. It's very long. This makes it a great weapon to hit enemies without taking damage, since you don't need to get too close. Its attack rating is in the middle of the pack, and it's a bit heavy for a spear, but you can find it very early on in Stormveil Castle. Also, its unique R2 attack is very situational. Sacred/Flame Art and Magic are essentially tied for the first spot, with Fire and Lightning coming in a close second and Heavy a distant third. Heavy outperforms Keen by 35 attack rating at this level, so it's primarily going to be a strength weapon. I like to play this weapon with a Great Shield for block counters because of its natural inclination for strength, and because it has such long reach. Using something like Repeating Thrust on this weapon also works very well, since you can begin its windup from such a long range. I like to set the Blood Affinity and lean into this Ash of War using block counters as necessary. Much like a dual wield setup, talismans like Winged Sword Insignia and Millicent's Prothesis help here, as does Lord of Blood's Exaltation if you go the Blood route, since you'll be hitting rapidly. Up next is the Spiked Spear. The Spiked Spear has a slashing R2 shared with the Partisan and Death Ritual Spear and deals physical damage. It has an average weight for a spear in Elden Ring, weighing 6, and requires some points in strength and some dexterity in order to use. The Spike Spear is more or less the same as the Partisan, as they have similar length, they have similar attack rating and weight, and both can be acquired quite early in the game. However, the Spike Spear has native bleed buildup on it, making it the better choice between the two as long as you don't care about appearance. Sacred and Flame Art and Magic are essentially tied for highest attack rating, with Fire and Lightning coming in second and Keen way back in third. Keen barely outperforms Heavy by 10 attack rating, so it's not super important which you choose. I like to pair this spear with another bleed buildup spear like a second Spiked Spear or Cross-Naginata for increased attack damage with L1 attacks, utilizing the bleeding in boss fights as it doesn't normally trigger out on the landscape or when facing basic enemies. Use Winged Sword Insignia and Millicent's Prothesis to boost attack power and have high protection and poise so you can trade damage, ideally while using the Spear Talisman. Only slot Lord of Blood's Exaltation during boss fights, since you won't need it any other time. Next is the Cross-Naginata. The Cross-Naginata has a unique moveset compared to other spears with a combination of pokes and slashes and deals physical damage. It has a heavy weight for a spear in Elden Ring, weighing 8, and requires some points in strength and some dexterity in order to use. The Cross-Naginata is arguably the best all-around spear in Elden Ring. It has the highest attack rating, barely edging out the Bolt of Gransax. It's one of the longest spears, it has native bleed built up on hit, and it can be acquired relatively early in the game in Gale Tunnel. The only negative is that it's rather heavy for a spear. Fire and Lightning take the top spot when it comes to attack rating, with Magic coming in second and Flameheart and Sacred coming in a close third. Keen outperforms Heavy by 31 points, making this a dex weapon versus strength, with Cold even outperforming Heavy. I like to play this weapon as a hybrid build because even splitting your stats between Faith and Dexterity, you still have decent attack rating, and then you can buff your weapon with Blood Flame Blade or Lightning Armament, while also boosting your damage with Golden Vow and Flame Gravity Strength. When combined with an Ash of War like Repeating Thrust, you can boost your attack power over 1200 with talismans like Winged Sword Insignia and Millicent's Prothesis, making this a very deadly weapon. Up next is the Clayman's Harpoon. The Clayman's Harpoon shares the default attack of most spears and deals physical and magic damage. It has an average weight for a spear in Elden Ring weighing 5.5, and requires some points in strength, dexterity, and intelligence in order to use. The Clayman's Harpoon is a phenomenal spear and one of few weapons that can be infused while also dealing another damage type other than physical. It has exceptional attack rating, falling just behind the Cross-Naginata, and you can acquire it rather early by farming the Clayman and Siofra River. Sacred and Flameheart have the highest attack rating, followed by Magic at a close second, and Fire and Lightning a distant third. Heavy outperforms Keen by about 20 attack rating, making this weapon lean a little bit more to the strength side of things. The Clayman's Harpoon is extremely versatile, and there are really so many different ways that you can play it, but I actually recommend to leave the weapon on its standard infusion, because this way you can boost its damage with strength and intelligence, and you can still buff it with Scholar's Armament. When buffed with 50 strength and 50 int, you will hit close to 800 attack rating, and you can further increase this with Magic Shrouding Cracktire and Magic Scorpion Charm. Throw in something like Repeating Thrust and Rotten Winged Sword Insignia, and you'll have reached well over 1200 attack rating, which is a lot. And last we come to the Celebrant's Rib-Rake. The Celebrant's Rib-Rake shares the default attack of most spears and deals physical damage. It has a light weight for a spear in Elden Ring weighing 5, and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to use. The Celebrant's Rib-Rake is the worst spear in Elden Ring. Not only does it have the lowest attack rating, but it can take you hours to farm in Windmill Village, which is a decent ways into the game. The only positive of this weapon is that it provides you with 10 runes when you damage an enemy with it. However, it does have an internal cooldown that shares the same timer with any other Celebrant's Rib-Rake, so dual wielding them doesn't even help you gain more runes. Fire and Lightning are essentially tied with Magic for the top spot, with Flameheart and Sacred falling just behind and Keen pulling up a distant third. Keen outperforms Heavy with this weapon by about 35 points, so you definitely want to use Keen over Heavy if you don't like any of the other infusions. I recommend avoiding this weapon entirely, but if you do wish to use it, pair it with another dex scaling spear and dual wield it for fast L1 attacks that help you mask its low damage. Use similar talismans and gear to other dual wield spear setups. Well, that wraps up our video on spears and the pros and cons of each one and how they can be used in Elden Ring. I hope you guys found this very informational. We have more weapon videos yet to go. If you'd like to see a particular weapon group we haven't done yet, please leave that in the comments. And as always, we have more builds coming.